you gotta figure out capture, right? You gotta hit capture.
Yeah, once. If you hit it twice, it starts two of them. All right. This is a resumption of a class that is just starting its 6th year. So you're in for something that you don't know, that you're hopping in the middle of something. This is a reintroduction and a review so that people who are starting new know what's going on. Now this is a class called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. It is meant to be an advanced course in astrology. And it includes a lot of psychology and mysticism. Now this class is preceded by 3 other classes. The most introductory is called Topics in Astrology, and the beginning technique course is called Astrological Tools and Techniques, and the intermediary course is called Character Appreciation with Astrology. And they are all available at a website, which I should have put on the board. And they're all available for free. And all of the textbooks are there for free. And it's a teach yourself what it is. There's a lot of videos like this very video. And workbooks. And step by step you can go all the way through everything. I'll warn you that it's a lot of work. The class that precedes this one, which is called Character Appreciation with Astrology, has 105 videos. And it took a good number of years. But it's something, if you want to learn astrology and understand people, it's a good way to start. Now, there are several ways in which an astrology class can be advanced. One of those ways is with technical mathematics. This is not that kind of advanced class. I marvel at those people that can do that they can find the exact time and place where something occurs and when there's going to be an event and what to look out for. But I don't care for that. I'm of the opinion that technical astrology is not as important as trying to understand the psychological and social and spiritual needs that people have. And so this is not an advanced technical course. Now, another way in which an astrology class can be advanced is in the depth of the ideas that are presented. And as far as I'm concerned, in every class I give, I try to give as deep of ideas as possible. If you get them, you get them. If you don't, you don't. But at least there's something to challenge someone, and this gives somebody something to meditate about or think about. And if it can't all just be simple. There does have to be some simple things in the mix, because I think that intellectual digestion is very much like the digestion of food. If you have a diet that is nothing but concentrated food, like if you had tried to have a cheese diet and eat nothing but cheese, it wouldn't work very well. You need roughage and you need a mix. Another way an astrology class can be advanced is in the amount of astrological life and character is considered. because there's a lot of information in a horoscope. It's a whole life. It's a whole character. And as usual, I forgot to turn this one on, but it's basically a backup. There's an awful lot that's in a horoscope. You can know a person and you can work with them every day and not know a lot of little details in their life, or not know about things that are very important to them in their life because they never come out in that facet of life. If you're a co-worker, that's a different house than if you are somebody that you party with someone. So that is the kind of astrology that this is. It is to get into the psychological, the social, and spiritual needs of the individuals. And it gives a number of ways that things can be interpreted. Because astrology is very much like an art in that it's interpretive. Like if you give the same piece of music to 2 or 3 musicians, each one will interpret it different, because it means something different to them, and each one has a character or a flavor of their own. So that's the kind of advanced course that this is intended to be. Now, even at that, when we're trying to go into the depths of character and understand it thoroughly and look at a lot of the different vignettes of it, the course is going to be laughable, because even at that there is so much in a human being that we can't possibly get to it all. And hopefully what doing a course like this does is it points you so you can know a direction to look in, and then you can figure out things for yourself. Now, when we do things this way, it's important to have some things in mind. And it's one of the most important things and one of the most ignored things in all of astrology. And that is relative significance. Some things are more important in a horoscope than others. Some things are more important in life than others. For some people, their pet is as important to them as their children. So in this course, following the course that preceded this, we have an estimation system. And it is intended to give a relative significance to the most important astrological factors. It's tedious, it's detailed, and it is seemingly comprehensive. But in reality, it is actually very rough, and it's intended to be very rough, because it can't be complete, because astrology is one of those things that you can put in hundreds and hundreds of factors, and you can't have a system that gives a relative estimation of all of those factors. So please, please, please remember that when we go through these things and we give a lot of numbers of relative strength and things like that, remember that they're only estimations. They are important, because if you have a situation where there is an event, if a person has a situation where they might be in accidents, but they also have something in their character and in their horoscope that they have a rescue quality, and there have astrologers that have done things like this. There's a person that has twice been in accidents with an automobile, and in both cases his head was almost run over, like it was like inches between the car wheel and his head. And you look, if you understand that the factor that is the saving factor is stronger than the factor that leads to the accident, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to get to. Or if a person is in a tempting situation and they're tempted to get drunk or tempted to stay home and study or do something like that. You can see what kind of war goes on in them and how much they have to do to overcome the temptation to something that is unregenerate. Now, this course is laid out in 3 phases. And we're already done with the first phase. And the first phase was a recapitulation of all the courses that came before. But it was not just a review. It was a reapplication of everything that was learned in those courses, but everything was carried into psychology and into mysticism. For example, there is in astrology a way of classifying things by whether there's something is of cardinal importance or whether it's of sustaining importance or whether it is of mutable importance. And those are astrological designations. But in psychology, especially in the psychology of Carl Jung, there are all kinds of typological ways, introvert, extrovert, emotional, intellectual, sensate, intuition. He has a very clear typology. Freud didn't put it out as clearly, but Freud also has a typology. And so when we did the astrological typology, we also went into the psychological typology and we tried to relate it to the findings of mysticism for understanding what a human is. As far as I'm concerned, I've spent most of my life studying things, and the description of what a human is best given by mysticism. Materialism sees a human being merely as a biological organism. Mysticism sees an individual as a creative truth knower, a spiritual being. And that truth knower can conceive ideas, can create thoughts, can have emotions and motivations, and has an organism for activity, and then the physical organism to carry it out into the external world. Now that's a very good description of what a human is. You don't find that at all, not even in Jung's psychology. Astrology was developed by mystics over many, many years. Madame Blavatsky, for example, claims it's a matter of millions of years. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. But so what we're trying to do then is we're trying to look at the inner structure of character. And we did that first in recapitulation, getting the broad picture as we did in courses preceding this. Now, in our times, astrology, psychology is very important. It didn't used to be. We just used to just take people as they are, and we didn't try to understand their motivation. And it's clear that if we want to help people, people have problems. And if we can psychologically understand those problems, we can understand how to help them see clearly what they can do. So for this reason, we're studying the horoscopes of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And we're also studying their psychological systems, and we're being pretty detailed about that. Because there are a lot of people out there that claim they're Jungian astrologers, and they don't go into Jung's psychology at all. They're basically throwing around big terms, and they don't actually get into using it. So we're also using astrology to understand how astrology shows what is psychological. And when we look at the horoscopes of Freud and Jung, we are looking at how their character led them to see the world and the psychology and to develop the psychological system that they developed. The basic idea is what you are in yourself is what you see in the world or how you see the world. It's a very important thing. We don't think that the systems of Freud and Jung are the be-all and end-all of psychological systems. There have been quite a few extensions and new psychologies that have come since then, but most of psychology nowadays is more like a branch of physiology, more like neurophysiology than it is like psychology. The reason we're using Freud and Jung is not only because they were pioneers, but because they had psychologies that considered much of life, many different facets of life. They didn't focus on one little thing. And they put out quite extensive systems. And that's excellent for what we're trying to do. That's what we did in the first phase of the course. And we are now just about in the middle of the second phase of the course. And the second phase of the course is analysis of the charts of Freud and Jung, house by house, astrological house by astrological house. And when in this phase of the course, the first thing we do is look at the house per se, as it is in astrology. Now, a lot of that is done in the course called Astrological Tools and Techniques. In fact, in that course, if you look in the textbook, and the back of the textbook is a very long list of keywords for houses and signs and planets and aspects, and you get a very good understanding. But what we're trying to do now is look at the houses in a very different way. This is important because what happens with most people is they get into their way of doing things and in their way of interpreting things, and that becomes a barrier sometimes to understanding the person who is in front of them, the person they're trying to help. And so if you have a certain view, say, of the 11th house or something like that, and the person presents you with a problem about the 11th house that you've never seen before, you might be stumped. So the more different ways you can look at a life circumstance or some kind of a situation that someone finds themselves in, the more different ways that you can do that beforehand while you're studying, the less likely you are to be stumped. You're not going to sit and look at a horoscope and say, "My goodness, I don't understand at all what's going on." So you have to open yourself up, and so that's what we try to do in this. Now, the final phase of this course will be very short, and it will be a summation of everything that has been done over the years. And I suspect we have 2 more years after this year before we finish this course, and then that final year after that. I might not be alive. I might not ever get to finish this course, even though I have other ones that I'd like to offer in different things. So, at any rate, it's a summation so that you can get an understanding of the horoscopes of Freud and Jung, all the little details and facets and how they fit together, and so that you can understand their psychologies, what is important and what is not important, because they were evolving understandings. Like early Jung is very different from late Jung, and the same is true of Sigmund Freud. And hopefully there will be a better understanding of mysticism. All right, so we're going to resume from where we left off last spring. That is, we're going to begin with a reintroduction to the 6th house. And it's going to be a purely astrological study. And in this time through, in this phase of it all, I'm using a formula, or I'm using a setup that first we do this, and then we do this, and we do this. And I'm doing that to make sure that I don't stray and deviate back into old ways of thinking, and that I am forced to look at things in a new way in presenting the information. All right. The first way that we have been looking at a given house is as a mundane abstraction or a derivative of the sign that is it's in the astrological mandala. We are number 5. So the 6th sign is Virgo, and in the astrological mandala, 4 then. Yeah, all right. So, I'm sorry, I should have written them down on a sheet of paper. So the 6th sign and the 6th house are together, and so we're trying to understand the houses are mundane, they relate to things of this world, and the signs represent fields of attitude, and the houses represent fields of earthly opportunities. Now, they're in the pictorial zodiac. This is a symbolic zodiac. In the pictorial zodiac, there have been a number of pictures that have been associated with Virgo. And one of them is very important spiritually. It's the picture of a virgin holding her child, and it's found in several different mysteries, China, India, other places. And the idea of a virgin birth of someone who is to be a savior is common to a lot of different societies. Now, we're not going to talk about virgin birth because that's a big subject. I'm working on a little essay on that subject right now, so that because of the misunderstandings about that. And it's not parthenogenesis. If you're interested, that's a hint. It's about purity. Virgin purity. Something done without personal passion. It can be enjoyable, but it is something that is pure from any personal human, this is for me kind of thing. All right. Virgo has always been that. It's been known as a sign of purity. That's one of its highest ideals. Now, when we're looking at the houses, we're looking at mundane opportunities. And purity is not an opportunity, it's an attitude. However, we do have opportunities for purification, which is an excellent way to look at the 6th house. How to do things cleanly, how to do things efficiently. And the key words in those sentences is how to do things. The 6th house is about how we do things. It's about how we maintain in an ongoing life. And some of those activities are called chores. The 6th house is the house of chores. There are things that we have to do, and if we do them with an attitude that is like purity, we do them as well as we can. We want them to go smoothly. We want them to go easily. I even mopped the floor today. It was smooth and easy. So we purify the process. And process is another word for the 6th house. We clean our tools. We examine the method that we're using. And we always try to improve things. Now, with regard to our bodies, these things are called hygiene. It's the maintenance and care of our body so that we can do what we need to do when we have to do it. So we can see from the 6th house, from this, that the 6th house is a house of process, of how things are done. Now that's a very ancient pictorial zodiac. In a more modern pictorial zodiac, the Virgo is pictured as a female, sometimes an angel, lying on her back holding a sheaf of grain. Freud would have something about, he had a statement like, when a maiden falls, she falls on her back. He saw sex everywhere and in everything. In some cases, this divinity with the shock of grain, like in Greece, was Demeter. In Egypt, it was Isis, and so on. It was the idea of a productive mother, but it was an earth mother. And it is like the fruitfulness of the earth, which also gives birth to everything that lives and grows on it without passion. We put seeds in the ground and we water them, we care about them, we love them. If we have a garden anyway, we love the whole garden. And that's the way that's the way it works with the basic idea. Now, beyond purity, it has a more informal feeling about it. Demeter, if we look in Greek mythology, was not a goddess that was into prettification or anything like that. You know, there were beauty contests between the goddesses. The famous beauty contest that was judged by Paris, wherein he won the most beautiful woman in the world. You didn't see Demeter in that. She was down to earth. And that translates into something no frills. The earth serves us, and it serves us without fanfare. And so what the sixth house is about service. Anything that we can do well can be called service. Now, Mercury rules Virgo. Therefore, Mercury is the abstract ruler of the sixth house. And Mercury was the servant of the gods. But Mercury also rules Gemini, and the Gemini Mercury is different than the Virgo Mercury. See, he's not going to fall asleep because it's going to be a back and forth night tonight. The Gemini Mercury is more of a communicator. But the Virgo Mercury that we're studying is more of a facilitator. It's someone who carries things out or helps us to carry things out. And so the Mercury influence indicates a method. And it's a method or a maintenance that is mental. The sixth house is a service that we think through. That we think... I thought something, time to go. Does that mean a text message? Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, I don't text at all. I don't even have I have a little tiny flip phone, and that's it. So when we think of something in a sixth house sense, if we think of something like a tool, which is a sixth house thing, a tool is something that facilitates, we say, is it serviceable or is it workable? And that's what the sixth house is like. So the sixth house is a house of work, utile work. But not as an end in itself, because that's one of the dangers of Virgo and the sixth house. You can have the method be the all rather than the method to reach an end. Now, sometimes you can understand ends within the means, but if the means become the ends, then you have like busy work, just doing it for the sake of doing it. Now, another way we have been looking at the houses is as a consequence of the opportunities of the house that come before. When we did this, we related right back to the beginning of the mandala. And we said that the first house was a consequence of what had happened in the past. From the ascendant, which is the now point, going back is going back in time. Going forward is going forward in time. And so what we have right present before us right now is a consequence of what is ripe from the past. With this, you can understand any house in the zodiac by understanding it in its relation to the house that comes before it. And so we're trying to look at the sixth house. We say the sixth house is a consequence of the fifth house, or you might say that the fifth house is the 12th house to the sixth house. There's a technical name for that, but I don't think it's necessary to go into it. Now, understanding the sixth house in terms of the fifth house is not easy to do. And through the years, it hasn't been easy for me to do. And I ponder these things, and I've pondered over them for years. But the fifth house is a house of performing and of performances. And performances have consequences. For example, you have reviews. You give a performance, and somebody gives a review of it, very often a critical review. And the critical review is Virgo-like, to be certain. And with the sixth house, it is a living review. Like, there's another way we can look at it in this way. The fifth house is celebration. If you want to have a good time, if you want to recreate, if you want to have a party or something like that, that's the fifth house. The sixth house is the morning after. And if you've overdone the celebration, you're going to have a hangover or something like that. Or you're going to have, if you ate too much, you're going to have dyspepsia of one kind or another. So if we understand the sixth house, it is relative to the whole character, but especially to places, to situations where we recreate or where we perform. The sixth house is an understanding the consequences of that. How much the wear and tear on our physical bodies is what is indicated by the sixth house. All right. Now, another way we look at a house is relative to the house opposite of it. So we have Virgo and the sixth house are opposite to Pisces and the 12th house. Now, the difference between the sixth house and the 12th house is the difference between something being voluntary and involuntary. We're talking about service, and one kind of service is military service. The sixth house is voluntary service. It's much easier if you volunteer to do something, even if you have to do it, which is involuntary. It's much easier to do it voluntarily because the attitude is very different. Now, during the Vietnam War, I had a lot of friends that didn't want to go into the draft. And my work was to help them get positions of voluntary service so that they didn't have to go into the draft for involuntary service. Get them working with hospitals or something like that. And that's where I came to understand the relationship of the sixth house to the 12th house. Now, another way we can look at it is the 12th house is, if the sixth house is the consequences of how you've performed, the 12th house is that in spades, you might say. It's when things have really gone bad. So the sixth house is the house of the maintenance of health. But if you haven't taken care of your body, you end up in the 12th house. And the 12th house is the hospital. And so when you get, you don't have any choice. They take over and your whole life is in their hands. All right. Going along quickly here. I'm trying to get this all in under an hour if I can. Now, another way we've been looking at the houses is in the houses that are sextile to them. That is 2 houses away. The sixth house is sextile to the 4th house, and it's sextile to the 8th house. So by understanding some of the relationships between the 4th house and the 6th house, and between the 8th house and the 6th house, we can understand more about the 6th house in such a way that we can use them. In fact, we're going to do, when we get into Freud's chart next time we meet in 2 weeks, we're going to see how that works quite a bit. Now, one of the things that the 4th house represents is family ties. Your parents, the siblings, the relationships with siblings are the 3rd house, but the 4th house is the intimate family, the family dwelling, and things like that. So if we understand the 4th house relative to the 6th house, we can understand the 6th house better. The 6th house has often meant labor and things that have to be carried out. So, for example, if you have someone that belongs to a big family that's poor, you will find a lot of relationships between the 4th and the 6th house because they had to work to support the family. And their active part in the family was doing that kind of work. All right? Now, another way we can understand the 4th house is to understand it the way we've been looking at it, as the unconscious. Last spring, when we looked at the 4th house, we said that the personal unconscious, that which contains all of the personal attitudes that we have, the personal memories, the likes, the dislikes, the habits, all of those things that we have put back in our consciousness, and they are so far pushed into our consciousness that we are not in our being that we are unconscious of them. That is a personal unconscious, and even though they are pushed back, they are still alive and they are still active. It's surprising how sometimes out of the blue, an attitude that you had many, many years ago, something comes along and triggers it, and it comes out and it's alive, and as it has always been. Psychological things don't die easily. And so the things that we have in the personal unconscious, they relate to the 6th house. And the 6th house is a matter of therapy. That is the process of working out things that come from the unconscious. See, it's not just like healing the physical body, because there's wear and tear in the physical body. In the soul, there has to be, you might call it psychological hygiene, to clean up all of the bad attitudes and mismemories that we have and things like that that have to be straightened out. So we can see that sextile relationship, which is always a positive, almost always a positive relationship in astrology, between the 4th house and the 6th house, works in such a way that therapy works on drawing things out of the unconscious so that there can be a healing, or that there can be a cleansing. Now, if we want to get into like the Freudian way of looking at the 6th house, we know that the 4th house and the 10th house represent opportunities to be in touch with the parents. And most often in Western society, but not always, the 4th house represents opportunities to understand the father. Now, in Freudian psychology, because the father was dominant and such a power figure, we often have repressed feelings about the father. And so we can see that the relationship of the 6th house to the 4th house is a means of coming in the side door, so to speak, and to cleanse the repressed things that we have relative to our father as trying to dominate us, that in such a way that we can be healed from them. So the sixth house is a kind of healing, is a kind of cleansing of all sorts of unhealthy things. Now we can see similar things relative to the eighth house. That also has that sextile relationship. And that sextile relationship is used for solving problems. Personal problems are solved in the fourth house. That is when you overcome a bad habit or something like that. Shared problems are solved in the eighth house, like social workers who work with families or things like that, and they have a shared family problem. Those are often worked out in the eighth house. Universal problems are worked out in mental institutions and hospitals, or monks, in monasteries or places like even chemistry labs or things that are behind the scenes. You guys might even be 12th house people right now. But the eighth house is where you have solved shared problems. And the sixth house relative to the eighth house indicates by the therapy, if the sixth house is therapy, it indicates how shared problems can be solved. And the success depends on how well the sixth house part is carried out. Now you can do that with physical things too, because the eighth house is the house of death. And if you have a illness or a physical problem and your means of therapy isn't right, the patient's going to die. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that there is an indication between the consciousness of repair and treatment and therapy, and the success factor is indicated by the eighth house. All right. Now, another way we can look at each of the houses is that the Virgo and the sixth house, or the sixth house, is in a triplicity of houses. That includes the second house, the sixth house, and the 10th house. And the signs that correspond to them are earth signs. And they are how we relate to the earth. And these are called work signs. That is, they all have to do with some part of work. Now, in economics, we have the houses are a classic in economics. You have capital is the second house, is the ownership, is the basic materials that you work with. Labor is the sixth house. Management is the 10th house. So you can see that that you have to belong to one of these three in your work life, or at least one of the three. Another way we can look at it is raw materials, methods and means of working with raw materials, and the objective, what you're trying to objectively give to society. It's the kind of a product or the kind of thing that you can give to improve society. So we can see then that the sixth house in all of this indicates function. It indicates or misfunction or malfunction or something like that. And it is how things are transformed. It is transformed through the work that you perform on it. Now, you could try to generalize this and say that the sixth house is that to all of life, but that's stretching things a little bit too much. The 10th house is life goal. Like what do you intend to do? What is your goal in life? That is what is often indicated by the 10th house. All right, we're beating up here. There's some really interesting things in here that are going that I don't know if I'm going to be able to get everything out of the notes that I want to get out. Now we're looking at the sixth house relative to a quadruplicity. And that quadruplicity includes Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And in the houses, those are called, where are we here? They're called cadent houses. The first set of houses with the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th, they're called angular houses. They represent basic stances of action. The second, the fifth, the 8th, and the 11th are called succedent houses, and they represent things that stabilize, opportunities that stabilize that one carries on. But the cadent houses are sort of shifty houses. They have a quality of not being really strong. In fact, in astrology, it's been that way for centuries. They say that if a planet is in a cadent house, it is weakened. Now, I've looked into that quite a bit, and I don't find that that is always the case. And if it is the case, the weakening that comes from being in a cadent house is minor compared to something like the strength of an aspect or something like that. That's a really major thing. But if there is that influence, there has to be a reason why a planet being in such a house would be weakened. And that gives us an insight into what cadency is like. The cadent houses represent more indirect experience. For example, the third house is the house of reading. You can read about Taiwan, and you can learn a lot about Taiwan, but it's not the same thing as going to Taiwan. It's indirect. And the ninth house is the house of theory. And from theory you can conclude something, but the conclusion that you arrive at is not the same thing as experiencing it. So there is something about the cadent houses that has an indirect quality about them, and that indirect quality, because it isn't immediate in its experiential nature, is what has a weakening kind of effect. Now, what kind of things do we learn through the sixth house? I don't know if you ever watch, I don't have a television, so I don't get to see them, but there are a lot of British dramas about upstairs, downstairs, and all of those kinds of things. And in them you see very clearly that the servants, just by watching what's happening to the masters, learn lessons without having to go through the same stupidities that their masters do. And that's the kind of thing that is associated with the sixth house. It is a vicarious kind of experience, but it's a vicarious experience that is instructing, but not as well as direct experience. Now the sixth house, I want to go back to something that I skipped on the notes because I'm trying to keep it within an hour. That the sixth house represents labor. And people who are involved with labor and who are involved with the method, they have an attitude about them. And that attitude, even though they work for management, labor is always at odds with management, because they're lording it over us, or they're better than us. In fact, there are some people who are of an extremely right-wing point of view that labor doesn't have any voice at all. Since I'm hiring you and I'm management, I can determine what you get and what you don't get. And so there is that kind of distrust among labor and management, and it's ironic the way it happens. Because right now, the United Auto Workers are on strike with GM. And the same people that are negotiating with them are under indictment for cheating the unions, the unions that they are the executives of, because they've been stealing the money to go on trips and things like that. So there is that. This is a perfect example. I have never met labor people who felt that even their officers in the union served them well. And that's the kind of view that you get when you're in that position. Now, you can see that we've been dividing the houses equally into 2, 3, and 4. Now we're going to divide the houses again, but we're going to do them in contiguous areas. We're going to say that we can divide the houses into 6, into quarters, into thirds, or in half. We always use aliquot numbers so that it's equally divisible. Now, if we divide it into 6, the first 6 is the first and second house, then the third and fourth, and then the fifth and sixth. And in my experience, I don't gain much understanding about the sixth house by looking into it in terms of 6. So we're going to skip that. And we're going to look at it in terms of quarters. And each quarter of the horoscope, beginning with the first house, relates, in the zodiac, it relates to the seasons in the northern hemisphere. The spring season, from the vernal equinox to midsummer, is the first quarter. The second quarter is from the midsummer until the autumnal equinox, which we're just about to go through, and then we have autumn, and then we have winter. And the houses can be broken up in that same way. And that is a contiguous area. And in a contiguous area, the flavor of that area is determined by its center or by its heart. And if we're looking at the second quarter, that is the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth house. But the center of that is in the fifth house. And the fifth house is the house trying to say profound things and doing stupid the fifth house is the house of personal expression. So you can say that that second quadrant is the quadrant of personal expression. But the sixth house is not itself, it's not in the heart. It still is in that sector that is, it's in that quadrant that is personal expression, but it's not the heart of personal expression. So labor is not necessarily completely personal expression, but in that quadrant it has that quality. And I'm trying to get at something that might not be easy to get at, but everyone, whether they're flipping pizza dough or whether they're developing a golf stroke or something like that, in the performance or in the technique or in the process of doing something, there is a style. And so the quality of the sixth house is such that whatever work you do, there is a style to it. And that's what we get from that quadrant. Now, let's break it up into thirds. The first third of the houses is first, second, third, and fourth. The second third is the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, and then the last third is obviously that way. So we are in the second third. Now each third has a quality that's all of its own. and it's often determined by the kickoff sign. The first house is personal assertion. The second house is personal responsibilities. The bills have to be paid, and this is you have to have the income to pay the bills. And the third house is basic or simple relationships that you need to carry out your personal life. And in the fourth house, as we've seen all along this evening, is the solution of personal problems. So we can see that the first third of the houses is very personal. Then we come to the second third, and it kicks off with shared responsibility. Usually in most people's lives, that's children. You can't have a child by yourself. And when you have a child, you're in a partnership. Even if there's a divorce, the children are shared. The sixth house is the shared responsibility, just as the second house was the personal responsibility. So if you're working on an assembly line, for example, putting together an automobile, and you have only one job that you do, and you do it with your personal flair, the whole automobile is a shared responsibility. It's sort of like saying that if you are part of a workforce, or if you are part of a group that has to accomplish a given object in working, that is what is indicated. Those kinds of opportunities are what are indicated by the sixth house. I should have had all kinds of examples of this, but it would get awfully long that way. So we can then see that this is what the sixth house represents. It represents a shared responsibility. Now, we have one last thing to go through, and that is dividing the horoscope into two contiguous ways. That is, you can divide it in half, and there are two ways that is normally done. You can divide it vertically, so that you have the east and you have the west. Or you can divide it horizontally, so that you have the north and that you have the south. Let's look at both ways. The east is like right the heart of it. It is like individual or personal initiative. You initiate this activity to do something. The west is responsive. You respond when someone else has acted. Like that, right at the depth of the seventh house of the Western Hemisphere is the seventh house, which is marriage. And the individual is one thing in a marriage, but when you're married, you have to respond to your opposite or to your counterpart. Now we see that Virgo is just about as far west as you can get. And so it is a responsive kind of consciousness, responding to what others present to it, the work that it has. And you can see that what starts out here in the first house as I'm going to go charging into this, by the time it gets to the sixth house, it's thinking of others. In labor, you're not just thinking about yourself alone. You're not some kind of athletic star or something like that. Like, look at what I can do and what I'm doing. It is like you're looking at things in terms of others. All right. Now, if we divide horizontally, the northern hemisphere, or the part that is below the horizon, is personal. This is personal. This is me, a personal statement. But when you get above, it is you. You care about the other person, or the other person draws you out. If this is Moses goes to the mountain, this is the mountain draws Moses to it. So we see that the northern hemisphere is very personal. the northern hemisphere is very microcosmic. Whereas when you get up here in the southern hemisphere, this is society. Everything is before all of society. So the northern hemisphere is very personal, and the southern hemisphere is very impersonal, and it's very universal. It stands out there for everyone to see. If there's a scandal that the whole world is going to see, it's going to be a 10th house kind of scandal. So we see that Virgo is at the end of the microcosmic, and the working with others, or working in such a way that we accomplish something through a method or through a routine, that thinking of others is what pops one into the upper hemisphere. And so we can see that there's something about the 6th house that has more socialization than any of the other houses in the northern hemisphere. And that's exactly 1 hour. Now, would you put the first place on again? This is as far as we're going to go tonight. And if there are any questions, put that thing. Yeah. If you have questions, there is an address 1. No, on the 3.
3.
Yeah. Now there's an address on there. If you have questions, those questions will just send them into that mailing address there. It's, I think, 99 FOTS, and eventually they'll get answered. I can't say right away. Are there any questions right in the room?
Yeah.
Yes.
You were talking about house 4 to 6, and you mentioned the poor family, all right?
Yeah.
Now, that's the sextile. If you take it to the square and Gemini, where it's the siblings,
Yeah.
that would indicate helping out with the labor.
Yes. Yes. Yes, brothers and sisters learn how to do things together. Excellent point. Excellent point.
I don't know if this is a question really, but I kind of, when you mentioned that you mentioned something about the 5th house bringing the 12th house to the 6th house.
Yes.
Well, that immediately clicked a musical analogy.
Oh, yes.
Where you have like
Yes. Where you have the relations of subdominance and yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like that.
Dominant, yeah.
In astrology, especially that's in horary astrology. Horary astrology is sort of the I Ching of astrology. You ask a question, and the idea is that at the same qualities that are in the air that ask that question, the silhouette of that, the answer is also in the air. But you locate the question according to the house, and then you tilt the whole zodiac relative to that house, and then you have that relationship, and that's called astrological distribution. Yeah, it's something. The things that are in astrology are no different than things that happen in mathematics or in music or things like that. There are principles that are universal that come out in various different things.
Yeah, and then even further, the way that you were talking about the different interactions,
Mm-hmm.
it all really kind of seemed almost like the intervals in a scale, and saying you have this note and you
Yes.
play it against this note and this
Yes.
note and
Yes.
get this type of chord.
Exactly. What?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, some of those relationships are very clear. Probably the clearest one that you can see, like the most obvious I can think of, is the 2nd house. And the 2nd house has a 90-degree relationship to the 11th house. And the 2nd house is money. Lend a friend money, you've lost the friend. I've had that happen several times in life, but I'm still open to friendship, but I've lent money to friends, sometimes a lot of money, and never saw it again, and never saw the friend again. So there is that, there is an antagonism, you might say, that has to be overcome between possession and association in a friendly way.
So did an astrologer decide to put Labor Day weekend in September in Virgo?
Some people think so. Some people think so. Strangely, a lot of the holidays in the United States, like Halloween, happens when the sun goes into Scorpio, and Thanksgiving happens when in the Jupiterian sign Sagittarius. Yeah, some people think it happened that way. Some people think it's accidental, and some people think, so and so had an astrologer. I don't think that Roosevelt had an astrologer. I think Ronald Reagan did, but it was the astrologer there was very personal, and it was not somebody who had a great understanding of the world. You know, the forces that are in the world in solving those kinds of problems.
Actually, Gordon Duchesne did a talk on that. Remember?
Yeah.
About all the holidays.
Yeah.
The months they land in astrologically,
Yeah.
they line up really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Father's Day. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.